what I decided to do for this one is a little different than what I did with my previous one. I decided to go ahead and focus on some of the big themes for the unit and then go ahead and kind of branch off from there. So let's begin with the early modern era. Let's begin with the globalizing networks of communication and exchange. This is now where we have the beginnings of globalization because we actually have connections across oceans and across countries and across regions and across societies. It becomes extremely important and influential when we're talking about India, China, Japan, Eastern and Western Europe. This is where we get a distinct difference. Sub-Saharan Africa, and then obviously North America and Latin America, as evidenced by the colonists and the European powers that decided to go ahead and touch upon these lands. As we get to the next section, this first step, this idea of trade becomes much more global, becomes a much wider scale and much more important when we're talking about the impact of what's happening. It becomes much more intense because we now have new resources and new locations of where to find this information. It becomes a huge, humongous aspect of trade and expanding these empires. Let's go ahead and begin with the first one right there that identifies as the Indian Ocean. The reason that the Indian Ocean becomes even more important is not just because of the monsoons and not just because of the currents, but what starts to happen is the proximity of all of those countries and all of those regions become important when the Europeans come on board. When the Europeans come on board, you have this whole other involvement of people that includes their culture, their society, and enforcing their will upon these people. The Portuguese specifically came with the intent of forcing people, like in the Swahili city-states, Kilwa, forcing them to come under their rule, or Goa, and creating trading posts in order to improve their own economy. If we're talking about the Mediterranean, it becomes much more prevalent because of the increasing growth of what's happening in the Mediterranean with the Western European countries. It slows down to a snail's pace in regards to their connection to the Ottoman Empire, because once the Byzantine Empire falls in the 1300s, there really is no connection for them to return back that way. And so Western Europeans really take that as the jumping off point to really go across the lands and go ahead and experience other worlds. They become pioneers, they become open to innovation and open to technology and open to new experiences. Even though it's extremely fearful, it causes them to become extremely powerful. And those countries that refuse to do that, or that are limited in their way of thinking or in their politics, then become limited in what they can do for their own people. That means the Chinese, that means the Persians, that means those people that are not willing to make that pioneering leap. Sub-Saharan Africa becomes extremely important, especially when we're talking about the triangle trade and the Atlantic slave trade, because at this point they now become an extremely important part of the trade, not just for slavery, but also for buying European goods, which again stabilizes the trade route from Europe to Sub-Saharan Africa. Obviously, overland Eurasia, what happens there is that we see a disruption because the Mongols lose power, the Yuan dynasty falls, and as a result of that, we don't have that Silk Road anymore. Once the Ottomans take over the Byzantine Empire, we don't have the Silk Road anymore. And so that way of trading is dead. And so again, this leads into across the ocean and making those jumps and also causing huge leaps in technology and in art that now become a part of what happens with Europeans and Africans and Southwest Asians. One last aspect that we want to go ahead and bring into this is the Columbian exchange, the increased use of silver in currency around the world, and the impact and importance of Spain during this time period is huge. If we're talking technology, technology is another reason why we have such great trade, is because we have the increase of technology. The astrolabe becomes extremely important in being able to gauge length of where you are and direction. And what ends up happening is that we have new inventions of other ships also becoming extremely important, like caravels, like the huge ships that Zheng He used in order to traverse the Indian Ocean and to arrive in Africa. We have maps that become much more detailed because of this, and as a result, exploration becomes even better and much further reaching, all because of technology. The Islamic world starts to increase the use of mathematics and increase the use of the maps in their region. The Asian worlds include the expansion and technology in that part, but again, just for themselves, not necessarily for the world around them. It makes trade and travel that much more accessible. If we're talking here maritime reconnaissance, we know about Zheng He. He's one of my favorites, partially because he's a eunuch, but the other aspect of that is that he was smart. He was extremely intelligent in the way that he was able to maneuver himself into a position of power, and in order to be the admiral of this huge fleet of ships. If you can imagine, Zheng He's ships were so enormous that Nina Pinta and Santa Maria could all fit within one of Zheng He's ships. Again, the technology that was done during this time period is amazing. To go and take elephants and giraffes and lions and drop them off at the foot of the emperor. And this is how we get the acknowledgement of what's happening outside of their world. The other aspect of that is that the Ming Emperor decided that, well, if this is all the world has to offer, I'm good, don't need any more, and closing off their borders. That limits China and actually halters their growth for a very, very long time. Portugal. Prince Henry the Navigator never actually went on the ocean and navigated a ship himself, but he funded these trips in order to ensure that his people would be powerful and would have money and their economy would thrive. And this led to Vasco da Gama finding a way around the Cape of Good Hope, as dangerous as he was the first to do that. Magellan circumnavigating the world and his crew making it across, not necessarily him. But the impact of that and the increased trade that happens as a result of that, and the cultural impact of Portugal in places like Kilwa and Goa and Hormuz, like stated earlier. Oh, God, the Spanish conquistadores. It's pretty amazing the fact that they were able to go and take advantage of such wide swaths of Latin America during this time period. They were pretty disgusting and pretty gross, but the fact that they were able to, with the backing of the Spanish Empire and the king and Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, it was amazing, and it allowed Spain to be number one in production of silver, in production of gold, in increasing and expanding their empire. It became extremely important in doing all of it. You have the connections between the Eastern and Western hemispheres when we're talking about the Columbian Exchange. We have the spread of diseases, again, very similar to the triangular trade. We have things like cash crops, potatoes, and maize that are now transferred over from the Americas over to Europe. This leads to a huge increase in agricultural production, a huge increase in population growth as well as a result of the Columbian Exchange. Manioc, sugar, tobacco, all of these things get traded, and what happens is we have a continued growth in these regions as a result of the Columbian Exchange. Animals also become a huge aspect of that. You don't have horses or pigs and cattle here in the Americas until the Europeans come. I mean, what would the Wild West be if we didn't have horses? And this is due, again, to the Columbian Exchange. Now, granted, the Europeans came here and did destroy cultures and societies and languages. However, they did bring some beneficial aspects, which we now consider uniquely American. We have obviously the increase of these crops. We have this idea of cash crops, which means that the Americas are producing all this food, which means that the Europeans are taking advantage of it economically, and as well socially, we have the growth of populations, which is going to eventually lead to industrialization. But the other aspect is you have soil depletion and deforestation, and you have the extinction of animals because Europeans come, and with disregard for what's already existing in these places, you start to have a shift. You start to have the depletion of forests, the extinction of certain animals, And the disrespect that started with the people continues into the land. We have, obviously, during this time period, we have interactions that expand, and it intensifies these connections within these hemispheres, and it starts to expand and spread religion as well. We know that Islam was spread with local practices. We have that, especially when we're talking about Africa. We have how the African, like the Songhay, blends Islam into their own religion, and they blend it into their own culture. And this is why when we have Ibn Battuta coming and visiting, he loves the African women, but they have a lot more freedoms than they do in the Middle East, and that's something that he notices. With Christianity, we start to have the diffusion of religion across the European continent, and you start to have dissent as well, especially with the Reformation. Luther and his 95 Theses, by the way, that is the 95 Theses rap. It's kind of funny, but interesting as well. You start to have this discontent with the Christian church because they start to get high on their horses, let's put it so to speak. And what that means is that they begin to spend a lot of money. They begin to take a lot of money, and as a result, they build unbelievable wealth. If you go to Vatican City, there is literal gold on the ceilings and on the walls and in the paintings, and the amount of work that they acquired during this time period, the artwork is amazing and unbelievably beautiful. However, they spend a lot of money doing that. We see a lot of corruption within the Christian church, and we see a split as a result of that. And Martin Luther is the one that started to do that, especially when we're talking to the indulgences. And the indulgences are basically paying your way into heaven. And this was seen as a necessary evil, I guess, for the Christian church. But Martin Luther strongly disagreed, and he posted his ideas on the door of a church. And this led to the Reformation, the splitting of the church. And if you see the map there on the side, you see the Protestant Revolution, is what I like to call it. And you see the spread of the church. Henry VIII, of course, in the Anglican church, just spreading so that he could divorce Catherine and marry, his love in Boleyn. You see the split of the Christian church, and it became very, very diverse as a result of this. We see the spread of Buddhism as a result of the continuing trade routes. This mostly went more into China and then obviously into Japan, but it didn't really spread further than that because of the closed borders that these two regions practiced. We see the syncretism that's happened in Latin America. I spoke about it earlier, the Vodun in the Caribbean, which is a blend of African and Christian beliefs. We see the cults of saints in Latin America. The Virgin de Guadalupe, becomes huge in Latin America, still very much so today. She is seen as the saint to end all saints. She is strictly followed during this time period as well. And you see the spread of Sikhism in South Asia. This is still very much a part of their society today. Sadly, they are often mistaken for Middle Eastern Muslims, and last year they were actually attacked, and they were branded terrorists, and quite a few of them were killed. Again, misconception. What we have is an increase in capitalism. You start to see things that the wealthy begin to actually promote, and this has to do with the arts. I'm not going to speak too much on this is just brief, but the Renaissance is amazing. You see the artwork beginning in Italy. You see the unbelievable beauty that they were able to create as a result of this. You see the Venus right there, the birth of Venus. You see the use of science, using perspective and using mathematical equations in order to get the look right. This is where we get the golden rule of you're beautiful if your face fits a certain mathematical equation. We see the mini paintings in the Middle East and South Asia. This is normally done for people of power, and they're beautiful. Again, if you go to the Museum of Art in Balboa Park, you can see tons of these mini paintings. They're beautiful, and they're done in such great detail. A lot of it has to do with people in power, but it doesn't matter. The amount of detail placed into that is amazing. We see the increase of woodblock prints in Japan. We also see the increase of kabuki, which is down there at the bottom, kabuki theater. We see Shakespeare and Sundiata and Cervantes. We see Journey to the West. You see all of these pieces of artwork that are now placed there because you have the money to provide this to the people. We see people like with Shakespeare being shown the new world. You see them with new artwork that before this was only provided for the wealthy, but now because of the success of the British Empire, you see it spread further. We have now and the new forms of social organization and forms of production. So we're talking social organization, we're talking triangular systems, we're talking the increase of technology. We see with slavery and with the Europeans now in the Americas, we see peasant agriculture not necessarily increasing in the Americas. We see things like slavery being a thing. We see also in Russia, peasant agriculture increases, and this becomes an issue eventually for Russia. We see the impact and the beginnings of plantations and labor increases because as the economy increases, demand increases, and that means that you need to have more workers. This also feeds the triangular trade or the slave system. What we have are the frontier settlements in Siberia, and I tried to find a good picture of it, and there really wasn't anything available. So when we're talking about frontier settlements, we're talking about the expansion of the Russians into the central part of Russia. And this is normally the very cold part. There's not a lot of agriculture here, but there are a lot of natives. And so forcing them under to bend to their will, so to speak, was quite a task that the Russians undertook. And they were able to do so quite successfully in forcing the Siberian settlers moving from the western part of Russia into now new eastern part of Russia and Siberia, and forcing them to settle so that they could expand their empire, and actually giving them money and incentives in order to settle into Siberia. We have the growth of cotton textiles in India and the growth of cotton, which, if you notice down at the bottom, was seen more as a communal affair, but it was huge in increasing the economy of India. We have the continued silk textile production in China, nothing new. That was one of the only avenues that people could come in and out. We have chattel slavery, which you see a whole picture there of chattel slavery when we're talking about the Americas. Of course, you should know by this point that it was much more brutal in Brazil than it was in any other part of the Americas because of the brutality of the Portuguese. They were incessant in their violence, and they were quite destructive. And as soon as one died, they just simply went and bought another, and they saw it as a means to an end, meaning that was the way to make their money. We have indentured servitude becoming a thing, especially with the coming into the Americas, people wanting to leave their country for whatever reason and placing themselves in indentured servitude. And this, again, affected the empire in allowing them to expand their power and influence, but it also allowed people to actually leave and become almost like pioneer people in a land that had been completely unknown to the entire European world. We have the encomienda and the hacienda that become a major part of the Spanish going ahead and placing their will upon the people, forcibly, obviously, and killing off several of the natives, and then obviously continuing into killing off the slaves once they arrive there. We have the Spanish adoption of the Inca, and this does very well to go ahead and expand their control and rule in South America, especially along the Pacific coast. We have the increase of gender and social status that begins here. We have the Manchus in China that were very much a part of changing the status of the Manchus in general. We know that the Manchus were the nomads, and we know that they weren't very well liked and they weren't very well accepted, even though they were extremely successful. And so we have paintings like the one on the left of the Empress that they tried to place themselves in positions of power and drew images to make them that way. But they also very much delegated who did what. And so Chinese were very much left to administration, whereas Manchus were very much left to the military and the fighting aspect of it. We have the Creole elites in Spanish America, and this, of course, leads to this descent between the Creoles and the Peninsulares. However, they become extremely elite because they're the ones that normally hold the wealth and the land, but they don't really hold the power. That's more the Peninsulares. We have the European gentry, the lords and the ladies, and courts and courtly literature and things like that become a thing because of the increase of the economy during this time period. Urban commercial entrepreneurs, they become a thing now because, again, of the specialized labor and specialized industry provided for these people. They now have the money to go ahead and make some sort of influence within those urban centers and be quite powerful during that time period. We have the zamindars in the Mughal, which you see an image down there at the bottom, and they become important in administering the Mughal Empire, but also gaining power, even though not being of any kind of noble class. And of course, the increased power of the daimyo, which you see at the top. During this time period as well, we have the dependence of European men on Southeast Asian women in conducting trade, and they needed it because the men were normally away at war or busy in the trading centers, and so they really did need the women. On top of that, socially, the social structure was slightly different there as well. They weren't as strictly defined as the ones in Europe, and so men were forced to, and as a result, they became increasingly dependent on these women. We have the smaller size of European families. If you notice right there, they start to become smaller. Part of that has to do with increased in economy. They are better off economically, but you also have the increase of education, and it's surprising that with education, you have less children. You know how to keep them safe. You know how to keep them healthy. And as a result, you know also that it's unsafe to have 8 or 9 children. It is indicative of a growing economy, but also a much more educated society. And then obviously, that is a great picture, which I love down there because it shows the social hierarchy of the mestizo, mulatto, and the Creole. There became this increased use of this social hierarchy, very similar if you want to compare it to the caste system in India, where certain levels were responsible for certain parts of society and they couldn't intermix. The responsibilities couldn't. However, they could marry, but that meant that their children were going to be labeled differently. And so if you see a Creole and a mulatto woman and then their child, and you can tell just by the way that they're dressed, obviously they're fairly wealthy, but at the same time there's still a social distinction among the three. These paintings became extremely popular in the Americas during this time period because they're trying to show their wealth and power. Rulers try to legitimize and consolidate their power in several different ways. If we look at the Ottoman Empire and the Devshirme, these were obviously the Janissaries, and the Janissary corps were taken from whatever other Christians that they could find within their realm, especially along the Eastern European part. They took them and adopted them and taught them how to think and be true Ottomans. So when they were released back to their own regions, they learned how to govern and be an Ottoman and rule in that sense. And this became extremely effective in promoting the Ottoman way even into the Eastern European Empire. Vlad the Impaler, or Count Vlad, or Count Dracul, is one of the famous Janissaries who took what he learned and was able to use that in Eastern Europe, in what we now identify as Transylvania. The Chinese examination system became very much a way of indoctrinating the world and indoctrinating its own people, and as a result, it's still very much used today in teaching them the Chinese way and how to study and how to be a true Chinese person for the Chinese Empire. The samurai were a salary, which meant that they were connected deeply to the government because they relied on them, and this meant devotion and loyalty. And then obviously the arts which were used to display power: monumental design, urban design, courtly literature, and the visual arts. What we have here is a great example of the palace at Versailles that Louis XIV, the Sun King, used in order to make himself much more comfortable, but also was a great demonstration of his power, but also his wealth and extravagance. If you look at the Hall of Mirrors down there, it is quite large. and it can fit 100 people in there. And if you notice, it's actually painted in gold, and the mirrors, which were very difficult to produce at that time, were placed there to go ahead and reflect the brilliance. The gardens actually are quite stunning as well. We have other examples of architecture and arts. We have castles. We have a Japanese castle. We have a European castle. We have Shakespeare. We have Johannes Vermeer and the girl with the pearl earring. We see all of this because of the money, but also for people to say, me, look at what I've done. Religious ideas were also used. We already know the divine right. We already know the mandate of heaven. The Safavid, which I know that's the best picture I could find, when they use the Twelver Shiism to really substantiate who they were and to make sure that people understood what they were supposed to do. We see the Mexica or the Aztecs with human sacrifice. Again, that the gods looked down upon them with favor, and in order to do that favor, they use the sacrifice as a way to abate the anger of the gods. The Sangay and the promotion of Islam, that's actually a Sangay castle down there, or a temple. It doesn't really look like a traditional one, but it's based off of the resources that they had in hand. This is in Mali and in Timbuktu, and actually several of these has actually been destroyed by Muslim extremists, saying that those should not be up there because it is a blasphemous against Allah and Islam. Chinese emperors perform public rituals that show their support of Confucianism, but also that tell the people that they're supposed to follow this as well and look at them as leaders using Li Ren and Xiao, particularly Xiao. We see a difference in the way that religious leaders treat the so-called other. The Ottoman treatments of non-Muslims, they allow them within their realm, but they do force them to pay a tax. The jizya, obviously, they don't also get the same kind of rights and freedoms that Muslims do receive, and this becomes an issue later on, especially during World War I. The Manchu policies toward the Chinese that were traditionally Chinese, were not looked upon with the same reverence. They were left to the administration, but they weren't left to the power, and they weren't left to protection. They left that to the Manchus, and that's very evident based off of the political cartoon that you see down there. And then you see the Spanish creation of República de Indios. So again, establishing the other, establishing this group as not as good. And so they normally held the servants or the service industry jobs. It's even insulting to call it in service industry because it wasn't just service industry, it was servants. And being the lesser, and being like in the image down there, the people that put on the shoes, and they're the people you wipe feet on. We see expansion, and with this expansion we have gunpowder and cannons, and we see technology really being used in order to help this expansion. You're going to see a series of maps really showing that kind of expansion. If we're talking about land expansion, we're talking about the Manchus, and we see the Manchus really taking over and really imposing their will on such a large area. They were, again, not really seen as native Chinese, and so for the majority of the time that they were in control, they were not seen as legitimate rulers, and so they continued to try and impose that will upon more and more people, even down into Vietnam, going down into Korea, what we now know as Burma, Cambodia, and Laos. They expanded quite far than anyone had ever had before them. Next, we get to the Mughals. We see the growth of the Mughal Empire. We see Babur, obviously in the hot pink, right there in the central and in the northern part. And we see that Akbar, right after him, really did expand it to both the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal, using not just military strength, but also support of the merchant class. And then Aurangzeb, again, the southern tip never really comes under control of any one Indian empire, and this is the same of Chandragupta, the Mauryan Empire, and it's difficult because of geography. The Deccan Plateau does get in the way, if you see right there, of Akbar, but Aurangzeb is able to really maneuver around, but still the tip of India really does go out of his reach. And they're able to do this, and it's difficult because you have the Muslim north and you have the Hindu south, and it's becomes very difficult to really take that control and take that power and to unify this one India. And as a result, after Aurangzeb, it really just kind of falls apart because there is no commonality between the entire realm, and as a result they do fall back into regional empires and then eventually do become fully united, but under the empire and under the British flag as a result of imperialism. The Ottoman Empire, oh, the Ottoman Empire is so powerful and so unbelievably amazing. The fact that they extended so far, and this isn't really looked at as extensive or as important as the Romans, but they are. If you notice, they go all the way down into the Arabian Peninsula, down into Egypt, which Rome had a control of, all the way into the furthest reaches of Morocco, into the Eastern European aspects of the world. And that is most evident, especially when we're talking about the Janissaries, especially when we're talking about the impact of gunpowder empire to a certain extent. They eventually stop taking control, they stop expanding, and a lot of that has to do with the acknowledgement that they felt that they were the best and that nobody else really had anything else to offer. And so as a result, they stopped improving, they stopped innovating, and they stopped growing, and they started to lose a lot of that territory. And World War I is a best exemplifier of that. But again, that's into the next section. Russian and Soviet expansion. If we see here, we know about Ivan the Great and then Ivan the Terrible. It's when we really get to Peter the Great and Catherine the Great that we really see this kind of expansion taking place and this establishment of this Russian Empire. Now, we don't necessarily call it an empire because Siberia, for the most part, doesn't really count for most people because it's really just a whole bunch of cold, empty land. But because of the frontier expansion and because of the pioneers that they forced to move over there, we do see a huge growth and expansion. But please keep in mind, there aren't a lot of people living here. It's very different from the Ottoman Empire or the Manchu Empire because we don't have a lot of people here. So the impact is great because we see the growth of Russia, but they don't affect as many people as the other empires do. The Manchu and the Ottoman do. They impact a huge amount of people within their realm because if you notice within the Ottoman Empire, where they touch, that's where people live, and this is very different. But the Russians do expand all the way to what we now know as modern-day Mongolia, and this is still very similar, close, but to modern-day Russia's boundaries today. As we get to the maritime empires, we see the Portuguese and the Spanish in this map particularly. You see the Spanish possessions, especially in the Americas. They have a huge, huge realm. And the problem with that is that they don't keep it. And so since they were the first, they lose at the first, whereas the British are slightly late to the party, and they keep their possessions for much, much longer, and they're able to benefit from that for much, much longer. Spain, as a result of the Reconquista and the Spanish Inquisition, push out a lot of their intellectuals, and so that begins really the downfall of Spain, and that continues into modern times where they're still one of the ones suffering with the recession, and they are struggling to stay within the European Union because of the economic restrictions that are not placed on them. But again, that happens during this time period as a result of the Reconquista and as a result of the Spanish Inquisition. When you force the intellectuals out, you don't have any smart people left. And so that becomes a huge issue for Spain. They don't really take part in the Enlightenment. They don't really take part in that scientific revolution because, again, of the impact of Christianity and Catholicism in particular with the Reconquista. You see the Portuguese, again, also have quite a bit of land. You know, in Brazil, you can see how they have it, but they don't have all of Brazil. Even though they technically did have control, they didn't have the kind of influence. And so this is why the Amazonian tribes, a lot of the native people, don't speak Portuguese because they still were very much able to stay far removed because of the difficulty of reaching the reaches of the Amazon. This one I thought was hilarious because this is the British Empire, and so during this time period, and especially with the increase of imperialism, which is in the next unit, they really grow and expand and really push forth their influence. We know that they were in Dada. We know during this time period they're still in the America, so that's not quite accurate. But you can also see how they were in South America as well, in Central America, and Australia, and New Zealand, and India, and China. They were literally all over the world. So when the saying says the sun never set on the British Empire, it was true because at some point during the day, in the 24-hour period, the sun was always on a part of the world that the British Empire controlled. And then today, they control themselves and own themselves. Not necessarily true because there are still the British Virgin Islands, and the Falkland Islands down over there by Argentina, but very, very, very large change, especially when we're talking about more modern times. If we're talking about competition over trade routes, state rivalries, local resistance, we know people resisted. Not everybody likes the majority and the choices that are made during this time period. The Omani-European rivalry, we're talking about the Indian Ocean. They are trying to gain power and trying to control power, especially if we're talking about Oman, because that's the Middle Easterners. And they have control and they want control of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. And they want to be able to control a much larger piece of the Indian Ocean Basin network. And the Europeans really don't allow that to happen. They are pretty dominant, again, because of technology. That's still part of the Ottoman Empire, the Safavids. But they don't have the kind of technology and they refuse to use it. And so that refusal actually causes them to lose that kind of influence and the Europeans win. Piracy in the Caribbean, this is a huge setback to several European powers because they do lose money and they do lose that kind of trade and markets that happened during that time period because of the pirates. And the pirates take full control because it's very difficult to man the waters with soldiers and with enough ships to go ahead and take control over that. The 30 Years' War becomes important, especially because it creates this hegemony of Britain because they rule and they win and it makes them amazing. We see the Ottoman and Safavid empires. The map down there at the bottom actually is quite bright and colorful when we're talking about both of them and their impact, especially during the 1600s. They continuously fight over control and fight over influence, and the Ottoman eventually wins because the Safavids are far behind in technology, and you can also see that they don't control the most important parts, which are the trading ports, most of the trading ports. The Safavids actually lose most of that to the Ottomans. Riots over food. You see the samurai uprisings. You see, the peasant uprisings, especially when we're talking about Russia going against Catherine the Great. That's actually when Catherine stopped westernizing, when the peasants actually started to rebel and ask for enlightenment rights like in the Americas. Again, that gets slightly into the next unit, but it is important to understand that just because we have these imposing characters, it doesn't mean that they necessarily were well liked by everybody, especially the poor. If you notice, all of these are normally the poor, and they're rising up against the rulers who are imposing their will. This absolutism really takes hold. This is actually a more appropriate map if we're talking about the 30 Years' War. We see Europeans really fighting over each other and loss and gains of land. You start to see how the Holy Roman Empire becomes affected by this. You see the importance when we're talking about invasions, and it kind of happens all over. But in the end, it's really important to understand that it just caused more tension. This tension continues all the way into World War I, to World War II, and to a certain extent into modern times. Yes, they all belong a part of the European Union, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they look at each other in the same way. The 30 Years' War was important in establishing power, and power amongst the Europeans. What we finally have is a list of crash course videos as a review for this unit. And so this will help, especially when we're talking about trade, we're talking about expansion, and we're talking about the importance of what is happening during this time period. I decided to go more with the themes and the importance of the main ideas and the main themes. This is directly taken from the AP College Board Review website. So please use this as a way to guide you and understand the impact of what we have going on here.